So please bear with us. Thank you all so much for making time to join us today. We are going to accomplish a lot together across these next 2 days, and I couldn't imagine a better group of people to be doing it with. Speaking of great groups of people, I would like to ask all of the staff of AU to please turn on your cameras. Have we got them, Sarah? I hope that they're visible to you. These are the folks who work tirelessly on the front lines every day. They inspire us all to take action. They fight back against countless attacks. They bring their full talents and their full hearts. And they've been able to do so much work, even more than ever, amidst a global pandemic. We are all so grateful for you, the staff of Americans United. I am so proud to be able to work by your side every day. Everyone wave hello. Hopefully everyone can see you. We all appreciate you. And now, AU staff, turn your cameras off. Thanks for joining us. Like me, I know the whole staff so wishes that we could be seeing everyone in person. So now I have the honor of introducing Sarah Galuli, who you just saw come on before I did. And hopefully her name is familiar to you by now from so many of the emails that you've received. Sarah is our Vice President for Outreach and Engagement, and she came to us just 1.5 years ago when the concept of a National Advocacy Summit was in our strategic 5-year roadmap, and really a flagship part of it, because we're trying to grow our movement and grow our visibility. And Sarah, with the help of so many committed staff, has really made it, this idea, this concept, come alive. And she's done it with a grace and with a wisdom that's really infused our staff with a calm and a confidence as we've worked virtually throughout this whole process to get ready. We are so excited, Sarah and staff, to benefit from the fruit of your very hard labor. And so I want to basically take us there. Sarah, I'm thrilled that we're going to be beginning the summit with a panel of wonderful friends on the intersectionality of our issue, church-state separation, with so many other crucial issues, for which our issue is truly foundational. Sarah, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Rachel. It is my pleasure to be here. I had to pop on my headphones to deal with a last-minute technical glitch, but this is the world that we live in. Welcome. Good morning. My name is Sarah Galuli, and I am the Vice President for State Outreach here at Americans United. And over the last 18 months, as we've been preparing for the summit, we could not have imagined the world that we would be living in when we first dreamed up this idea. But we're so glad to still be joining you today, with over 700 people joining us throughout the conference over the next 2 days, nearly 100 lobby visits planned to meet with our members of Congress. We're just delighted to be welcoming you. Separation of religion and government means that you can decide whether and how to pray, that you can't be banned from entering the country because of your religion, and that no one else can use their religious beliefs to deny you your civil rights or your civil liberties. But we know that under President Trump, the president and his allies have really been doubling down on their efforts to reshape this critical American value from a shield to protect us to a sword to harm others. And that's why I am so thrilled to be welcoming 3 esteemed friends and colleagues of AU to help us understand what's at stake for different communities and identify how our liberations are really bound up when it comes to separation of religion and government. So I want to introduce our 3 guests, Hillary Shelton, Mara Kiesling, and Scott Simpson. Hillary is the director of the NAACP's Washington Bureau and the senior vice president for advocacy and policy, where he represents the NAACP's 500,000 members through his government affairs portfolio, working on a range of issues from affirmative action to equal employment protections, access to quality education, ending racial profiling, and so many more. He's also held prior leadership roles at the United Negro College Fund and the General Board of Church and Society at the United Methodist Church. Mr. Shelton holds degrees from Howard and the University of Missouri, St. Louis, proud Missourian here, as well as Northeastern University in Boston. It is also my pleasure to welcome Mara Kiesling, who's the founder and executive director of NCTE, the National Center for Transgender Equality. I had the privilege of working with Mara when I worked at PROMO, which is Missouri State Equality Organization, and it has been a delight to continue to work with Mara on the front lines of justice for queer and trans people. Mara really is at the center of the many policy victories and the education of lawmakers that has happened over the last decade and more through her work at the National Center for Transgender Equality. Mara is a proud Pennsylvanian who received her bachelor's degree from Pennsylvania State University and did graduate work at Harvard. And then I'm also pleased to welcome Scott Simpson. Scott is our last minute substitution for Nimra, whose name you may have seen on our materials. Scott is the public advocacy director at Muslim Advocates, where he leverages communications and campaigns to impact policies, news coverage, and public opinions about American Muslims. Scott previously held a position at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, which is another partner of AU, and he holds degrees from both Southeastern University and a graduate degree from George Washington University. Scott is the editor of 2 books, and my favorite fact about Scott is that he's also the nephew of gay liberation leader Ruth Simpson. So Scott, Hillary, Mara, if you'd go ahead and turn on your microphones. Rachel, we can turn off your camera. And we are just going to dive right in with a little bit of discussion. So I have a few questions that I've prepared for each of our panelists. And after we've chatted for a minute, we will then turn to audience Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question today, go to the Q&A box and drop in your question. We'll get to as many as we can. If you'd like to chat with members of the AU staff, you can do so in the chat box. So Mara, I'd love to get started with you. You know, the Trump administration has been terrible on LGBTQ equality in general, but the administration seems to have this particular animus towards transgender people. At AU, we were really
to join you in any capacity. And I will say, I mean, American Muslims, this isn't going to surprise, I think, your audience, are having their religious freedom and really their basic identity challenged almost at every juncture of American life. There's obviously the Muslim ban, which is not only still in effect, it's been expanded and now includes a quarter of people who live on the continent of Africa. And so the Muslim ban is very much in effect. It's very much denying American families just the basic right to see their families. And you have very sacred familial traditions, things like marriages, things like births, things like just coming together, and funerals, where they're just basically being denied. And that continues to this day. We can't really forget. It's one of those things in all the news cycle after news cycle of ugliness that comes out of the administration and day-to-day life. It's easy to forget that, but it's still in effect. And that's really just sort of one, tip of the iceberg here, because, some recent work here, like in schools, we represent women who are denied the right to wear their hijab just as tuition paying students at beauty colleges. A study was just published in the Washington Post yesterday that shows that school principals actually are more likely to deny services to Muslim families than non-Muslim families. At the workplace, we're representing several women who work at Amazon who have had their Amazon's been denying them the right to pray. as they should, and they should instead be working to pick out items for shipping instead of actually getting sort of what's your guaranteed right under the law and under the Constitution to have basic religious practice. Incarcerated Muslims are routinely denied basic religious liberty, even though they comprise about 10% of the incarcerated population. And that also extends to immigration, where we're not representing these folks, but we've been working with folks who have been detained by ICE in Miami, who are literally being force-fed pork by the facility there. So it's just sort of one indignity after another. This discrimination even goes to the grave in some instances. We're representing a cemetery in Virginia. We have to sue Stafford County because they won't let them build a Muslim cemetery for low-income Muslims in their county, even though they own the land, they have done everything right, and yet they still have to sue just for the right to bury their dead. And in times of COVID, at times when so many of our communities are facing heightened death rates, disproportionate to the numbers of infections that they're getting, this is really important. And to the point about the Trump administration, I mean, they are pulling in people, and this can be counterintuitive because we think of religion as being, one of the having the most protection, right? You think of the First Amendment, but unfortunately, there's an effort, and the administration and the folks that Trump is appointing are actively working to undermine the very definition of Islam as a religion. So if you can redefine Islam as something other than a religion, like a political ideology, which is what it's explicitly what Tony Perkins said. You can peel away their rights one layer at a time. So Tony Perkins serves on a commission for international religious freedom now, and he's on the record saying that Islam is not a religion at all. And that can make its way into jurisprudence. We just had last year, the Supreme Court had two cases that were very similar. Obviously, you don't want to overstate the similarity, but in February of last year, the Supreme Court heard the case of a death row inmate from Alabama named Dominique Ray, who wanted to have an imam by his side when he was executed. And the Supreme Court denied his stay. 6 weeks later, in a similar case out of Texas, a Buddhist man wanted a Buddhist chaplain by his side when he was executed, and the Supreme Court allowed that stay to happen. And so we're seeing different applications of the law. We're seeing efforts to redefine Islam, and then we're also seeing just day-to-day bigotry playing out in people's lives. So it's deep, it's cradle to grave, and this administration has a really important role to play in making that as permanent as possible. And so with the help of AU, with the help of the NAA and CTE, we've all been pushing back together, and we're really thankful to be a part of this conversation. Sorry for all the bad news, but the good news is that we are working together to get over this.
Yeah, Scott, I think it's so interesting the way you point out. Sometimes we can get in the habit of thinking about separation of religion and government or the First Amendment in a binary way. Either we're thinking about the Establishment Clause or we're thinking about the Free Exercise Clause, but you're really illustrating for us that for Muslim Americans or for people who are adherents to Islam around the world, in the United States, it's really both. It's really both that Muslims are experiencing a lack of both their ability to practice their religion, but also a lack of separation in religion and government that, due to Christian nationalism, targets Muslims in particular. So I think that's just such an interesting way that Muslims experience the both and of the lack of religious freedom in this country. And Hillary, sort of switching gears a little bit, AU co-chairs the National Coalition for Public Education, and of which the NAACP is a member, and we do that work in opposition to private school vouchers, and you all play a really key part in that coalition. AU comes to the National Coalition for Public Education to fight vouchers, school vouchers, largely in part because they primarily funnel taxpayer dollars into religious schools. But I'd love to hear more about why the NAACP opposes private school vouchers.
No, thank you, Sarah. It's great to be with you, of course, our friends at AU. And it's always more than an honor to be on a panel with Scott Simpson and Mark Kiesling. They're good friends. I know that I'm in the right place to get in the right kind of trouble. As John Lewis used to say, when I see the two of them either sitting next to me in person, of course, before coronavirus, is sitting on a panel like this virtually to talk about these issues. And as we look at issues of school vouchers, we're into a very similar problem of charter schools as well. But let me start with school vouchers. School vouchers are a tool that have an awful history of discrimination as a tool to be able to maintain segregation in our public schools. In essence, when states like Alabama and Mississippi, North and South Carolina, and others began to be put in receivership to actually have to integrate their schools, whether we're thinking about the Civil Rights Act of '64 or otherwise, commissions were put in place to oversee the process. The problem that we ran into is that the game that ended up being played is at the local school level. Decided to maintain segregation. What they would do is offer every school in the school district a school voucher. That means taking whatever monies that were allocated for them to be educated in the public school. They were quite segregated at the time. And because they wouldn't be able to segregate the way they had before, as we saw more of the implementation of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision, what we saw was them taking the money, giving a school voucher to a student. The students could use those school vouchers to go to private schools. Meantime, segregation academies, as we called them, were being built by entrepreneurs in those areas. Segregation academies that did not have the same oversight or restrictions in who they could or could not admit. They could admit anyone they wanted to, and they decided that those that they didn't want to admit were those that happened to be people of color. As such, resources were taken out of the public school coffers, utilized in private schools that segregate. Only the students that were white were able to go to those schools. Meanwhile, one of the main reasons we moved towards the kind of integration is because we saw a disparate impact on racial and ethnic minority-based schools as opposed to white schools. So what ended up happening? Were taken out of the coffer for the public schools. Black students stayed in the public schools. The white students moved to the white segregationist academies. And as such, the whole process and the purpose for integrating for equal protection and equal opportunity for a high quality education was literally shot in the foot. So in essence, those kind of approaches have been with us for a very long time. And we saw it again after that, even the movement in terms of charter schools. I'm sure we'll talk more about that a little bit later as well. And now they've been used as that kind of segregation tool as well. Let me be specific. When we talk about charter schools, we're talking most egregiously about private charter schools in which the resources are controlled by someone that doesn't have the same civil rights protection oversight as a local public school does.
Thank you, Hillary. We have been so proud to stand beside the NAACP in the work to fight school vouchers, and we know that they're going to be expanding all across the country in the light of the Espinoza court decision. But when you and I were preparing for this conversation, we talked a little bit about this interesting intersection where one of the issues that AU works on is around public displays of religion that are either supported by taxpayer dollars or public displays of religion in courthouses, statements about God or displays of the Ten Commandments in front of government institutions. And sometimes that is it feels like an issue that's like, well, what's the human impact? What's symbols? What does it matter? That's sometimes some of the pushback we get at AU. What do symbols matter? And you and I were talking a little bit about the movement in this country to bring down symbols of white supremacy and the Confederacy and why that matters. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about why that public symbolism matters.
I'm glad you asked that question as we think about the uses of symbols and really the power that symbols have. Power of the symbols have in carrying ideas, thoughts, an approach, and values. as we think about our communities all over the country. So the issue for us is what we were saying is we're thinking about segregation issues, racial discrimination issues, and otherwise, that oftentimes that symbol, this preserved, this upheld, and is one that's very anti-diversity in our country. Whether you're talking about the diversity of religion, the diversity of race and ethnicity, the diversity of gender, sexual orientation practices, and other differences as well, they carry with them a value. So when you look across the country, you begin to wonder, why is it that someone would value those that were very much against the integration of our country? Why would someone value those that were actually fighting to maintain a segregation, literal segregation in our country, a separation of states and people living in the United States as we go back to even the Confederacy? Why would anyone want to celebrate that? But what we've seen across the country in so many ways, the very values that come along with that people have not dug deep into to see just how problematic that is. Let me give you an example. We think about those who were fought for the Confederacy, as just one example. They were those that actually followed to implement a segregation order, a letter of segregation that was sent from their states to the federal government, saying we no longer want to be part of the United States of America. And as you read through those letters, it's fascinating for us wonks like me. If you read through the details of the letter, what they're saying is that very well, we do not want to have to adhere to not being able to own slaves, to not be able to have an integrated, multiracial, multi-religious constituency living in our state freely without violence and other problems along those lines. In essence, what we're celebrating is the ideas of, in this case, mostly men, that are put on pedestals as those that were somehow the heroes of places throughout the South, and we'll find other places as well throughout the country. So we know that those tools have been utilized for some time, but we know that those images, those symbols, are actually symbols of segregation. They're symbols of discrimination. They're symbols of us not working together to even fulfill the primary foundation of the US Constitution that guarantees all of us, regardless of our differences, regardless of our color, regardless of our race, religion, and other differences and whatnot, all of us equal opportunity and equal protection under law. Whether we're talking about, again, a good education, and whether we're talking about simply being able to be protected on our streets, regardless of what our skin color and other ideologies may very well be. So it's been important for us to recognize those issues as we've supported for a very long time, taking those symbols down, taking the symbols of those who happen to be Confederate generals that have been fighting for segregation in the country and maintaining that Southern way of life, as they would put it. So the push has still been on for us. We want to make sure that those issues are raised up and the content of these issues is preserved. Too often, because of the fight that's going on, more focus ends up being on the demonstration than the reason for the demonstration in the first place. The core of the issues, the very values that we preserve and that we hold close to us as American values, in which all of us are able to live freely in this country with that equal protection and equal opportunity.
Thank you, Hillary. It's such a resonant point to think about the values behind monuments and symbols. I'm certainly not equating Christian nationalism to violent white supremacy and the Confederacy, but very much for our Muslim neighbors, or our Hindu neighbors, or our Jewish neighbors, or our atheist and non-religious neighbors, those symbols of Christianity in our courthouses or in our government buildings. What is the value that we're communicating? What is the value of welcome that we're communicating or not communicating?
I agree. If I can add to that,
please.
One of the real challenges for us is when we look at the convolution of religion in this process as well, that is somehow suggesting that if you are a Christian, very well, anyone that is not Christian, Muslim, Jewish, and otherwise is inadequate, somehow less than human in too many cases, but actually convoluting the Christian religious teaching in and of itself. Let me put it like this, Sarah. Look, I'm a homegrown Baptist boy. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. You mentioned Missouri a little bit earlier, so go Missouri for those of us who appreciate that. But both my parents were from Mississippi. And with that Southern perspective and otherwise are very much a part of what they brought with them when they moved to St. Louis, and when me and I've got 6 brothers and sisters who were born. Those are the values in which they raised up. In my study, whether it's Sunday school on to even classes in college, I've not seen anything that supports the convolution of religion as it's been utilized and then leveraging it towards political power. The United States, the way we've seen things here. That's the convolution that's utilized against people of color, whether you're African American, Hispanic, Native American, other differences and so forth. Whether you are someone that is part of a sexual orientation perspective that is not consistent with the really convoluted heterosexual values that are too often lifted up as we think about Christianity, as if we've heard the right-wing extremists utilized throughout the country on these fights. So again, it's sad to see that we're still having the old fight, but utilizing modern tools. That is, I've seen segregationist songs being done to music videos that were written not 10 years ago, not 20 years ago, but just last week or so, and are promoted on segregationist, white supremacist, online radio type stations, even those in video programs and otherwise. So we know that that fight is on, and that they're utilizing religion, as we've seen too often, the argument being my religion, and too often in this country, my interpretation of my religion should carry the day, regardless of what the law says, regardless of what the fight ended up encountering as we took those cases to court to fight for integration and equal opportunity for all. We know that fight is on there, but we also know that it's not just an ideological fight. It's a fight that transitions from the ideological to that is programmatic, the kind of resources that we would allocate for programs that should provide equal opportunity, whether we're talking about programs to make sure that things as basic as every American, regardless of our differences, should be able to cast an unfettered vote and have it counted. Every American should be able to go to the school of their choice, and the color of their skin and other values are not things that should be able to lock them out if they want to come in and learn from those particular schools of higher education and otherwise. And even old codicils should be reminders of us of the tools that were utilized to even keep us out of certain neighborhoods and certain communities, again, because of the value and the race, the ethnicity, the gender, and other differences that we may very well bring to the table. So we know those issues are crucially important as we're having this struggle. It's not just an ideological argument that two people can have, even though we can do that too, but it's something that translates also to real program, the utilization of real resources, the real opportunities to be able to live in America, to be able to live wherever our hard work would take us, to be able to keep a job regardless of our religious values and even our religious garb, to make sure that every opportunity is available to every single one of us, because it's clear, if they're gonna come after me because I'm African American, they're gonna come after Mara, and they're gonna come after Scott, and they're gonna come after our friends at AU because you guys believe in the diversity of America and equal opportunity again.
Yeah, this theme of keeping people out. Scott, I'm going to come to you in a minute. I would like to hear more about Muslim ban. But before we do that, Mara, the Trump administration recently released these terrible rules that I was mentioning that govern homeless shelters. And they're just particularly cruel when it comes to trans people who are seeking shelter. Can you tell us a little bit more about that rule? You're on mute, Mara, so if you can come off mute, there we go.
I am like the worst person in the world of putting myself on mute and then forgetting to take myself off. Yeah, so, you know, the first thing to know about the HUD rules is they aren't going to stand. These were released prior to the Supreme Court Bostock decision. They were mean-spirited, they were dumb. They were happening in the middle of a pandemic where being homeless and not having shelter is an exacerbator of the pandemic. Just everything about them was typical Trump incompetency, and cruelty, and just stupidity. And this one even had a little bit of a Ben Carson kind of feel to it, because it talked about, it basically said, well, you know, a man and a woman, you can really sort of tell, and you should be able to judge people by their height, because tall people are men and short people are women, and you should be able to tell by Adam's apples. And so it was kind of personal that way. But it's really about the overall trying to roll back trans rights and trying to make trans people invisible. When I was coming up and coming out, but coming up in the 90s, and I went to my first trans support groups, what we all told each other was, when you transition, you're going to lose your job for sure. You're probably going to lose your family. Some judge is going to call you a freak and say you can't see your kids. You lose your health insurance. You'll probably lose your home. And somebody asked the question about some examples of successful efforts to protect trans rights. And I could point to hundreds of things over the last 20 years. I think it's been one of the fast moving social justice movements in the history of the country. And we ain't there yet. But this rule at HUD, you know, is it going to go into effect? I guess, but it's not going to stand very long. Although, you know, if Trump wins re-election, you know, I guess we don't really know what'll happen. And if I could just, I could answer specific questions about it. May have been a little rambly, but I also want to say something that I said in the explain something I said at the beginning. I believe that Donald Trump personally probably doesn't feel animus towards trans people. I did not mean to imply that I don't think he is a racist, a white supremacist, deeply anti-Muslim. I don't think he cares one way or another about religion, other than apparently now he's signing Bibles for people to sell on eBay. But I think he is a deeply messed up, horrible person. And when it comes to race and Muslims and immigrants, the xenophobia is very real. The Islamophobia is very real. I just think he doesn't care one way or another about trans people. So he's fine to put us into the religious white meat grinder.
Yeah, and Scott, tell us a little bit more about some of the efforts to combat some of that religious meat grinding. We know the House recently passed the No Ban Act. What is that? What would it do? Why do we need it?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking that. And that is good news, right? And I will say this, is that the House just passed a few months ago, the first time in its entire history, a civil rights bill meant to protect Muslims in particular. And that took what felt like a Herculean effort from many, many people to make happen. And to give you sort of a sense of that, is the No Ban Act passed on a bipartisan basis, thank you to Republicans, one of which is retiring, of course, for voting that out of the House. But the No Ban Act would stop the Muslim ban. It would also codify, it would include religion as a protected class in the Immigration and Nationality Act. It would also put some guardrails up to make sure you can't abuse the authority under the INA to just ban people because you don't like if they worship, how they worship, that kind of thing. In order to get there, we needed to first have a hearing. And people in Washington, or people who pay attention to these things, they sort of take that of course you need to have a hearing. One of the problems was that the House had never, ever had a hearing on the rights of American Muslims. So we had to do a lot of work, both behind the scenes, but also officially with members of Congress. You know, you want, you know, in some ways it's very easy to vilify the Trump administration. It's easy to vilify these folks, but, and it's very easy to get a consensus, particularly around like-minded individuals about what is bad. But it's often as much of a challenge to get people who are otherwise actually well-intentioned, people who would otherwise stand with American Muslims, to get them to take sort of proactive action. So even getting co-sponsors was pulling teeth from otherwise friendly folks. But eventually it came up, right? And eventually you had almost all the Democrats got on it. Eventually you were able to have that hearing, and the hearing was very moving. What we had was victims of the Muslim ban spoke to members of Congress for the first time officially. You had members of Congress who were otherwise very anti-Muslim saying thank you for coming speak with us today. There's a very right-wing Republican saying some of my best friends are Muslim, some of my best friends are Iranian, like things that just really twisted the nature. You also saw them retreating from this idea that it's a Muslim ban. Their number one argument was, this isn't a Muslim ban. This is a national security effort based on narrowly tailored to several segments of the community. And that couldn't be farther from the truth. So we get to have that hearing, and what you're doing is you're socializing members of Congress that it's okay to work in favor of American Muslims. That's what's happening. That's the process of building co-sponsors. That's the power of a bill. It's not just some symbolic thing. What we're doing is we're giving members of Congress who frankly haven't done a whole lot with American Muslims, don't know the community very well, a chance to work on the issue, be comfortable with it, develop a language for it. And it passed in a it felt historic. You had Rashida Tlaib, one of the first Muslim congresswomen, right, presiding over the House vote. You had the Speaker of the House speaking at it. And that's powerful. And that's the good news, right? The good news is that there is an energized, broad and diverse coalition of folks who are really coming together behind all of these issues. And that's not, by the way, like something to take for granted, because there are very clear efforts on the right to peel us away from one another. There is a sense, they know it, they smell it, that the coalitions that we represent together are soft. They feel like they can peel us away one community at a time. They feel like they can divide us. And the credit that I really give to how AU approaches the work, in particular, because I think you do a very good job at this, is resisting that urge to like fall victim to what's the word, like fear mongering or demonizing of individuals, because that's their strategy, is to shave us apart from each other, and that's not what's happening now. But I can't really state this enough. The ban is still in effect, right? And we still have families that don't get to see one another, and it's worse, and it's being used to deny people of color entry into this country, and it's hurting our COVID response, by the way. There are many doctors that are banned under the ban. Actually, a significant amount of medical professionals came from banned countries. And so it's actually hurting our ability to respond to the crisis that we're in.
Yeah, on this point of good news, Mara, I believe you were there as well about a year ago when the House voted and passed the Fully Comprehensive Equality Act, which is a bill that would protect the rights of LGBTQ, both gay and lesbian, bisexual, and trans people in a wide range of areas of statute. And much sort of similar to what Scott said, I cried on in the gallery that day. Because I remember when Congress debated previous versions of that bill and the rhetoric that was used, but when that bill was debated and voted on in Congress in 2019, the light years of difference in the way that our elected officials understood the lived reality of trans people and LGBT people. It sounds like, Scott, similarly, the light years of difference in having a conversation in this country. It was an incredible day. Mara, I don't know if you want to say anything about the Equality Act or not, but. You are on mute.
What it looked like.
There you are.
Okay, I suddenly felt like I probably just reading my lips and it wasn't good. But what Scott said about passing legislation is really important. You know, we worked, Hillary and I worked a lot together on the hate crime, the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Hate Crime Prevention Act. You know, our friend Michael Lieberman worked on it for almost 25 years or something, and it finally passed, and it's an important bill. For trans people, getting it passed was almost as important as anything else. I say something that a lot of the lawyers in the movement don't like, which is about the Equality Act and the former Bill Inda, and even the hate crimes bill, is that what's in the bill is not as important than that it passes. It is Congress saying, you know, we hear you, we're not attacking you. And Scott, welcome to my world where every time you win over people in one of the parties, half of them lose the election the next time or retire. We keep winning people in the one party and then they retire or get lost or get beaten. But it's a really important thing. And the thing I'll say about the Equality Act is I'm really proud of how we did it as an LGBT movement. We really did work with lots of other movements, particularly important this time because it gets close enough to the 1964 Civil Rights Act that we had to have a rock solid commitment to do no harm. We can't mess with the 1964 Civil Rights Act and have any risk that it will hurt anybody else, any other movements, any other people, because those people are our people. You know, if you ask trans people what's the most important issue, they'll tell you, they all know, and I can tell you what it is. It is whatever the person you're talking to says it is. For some people, the most important trans issue they face every day is racism. Sometimes it's poverty. That is a trans issue. Sometimes it's the Muslim ban and they can't see their families. And so all of those things matter. And in the Equality Act, we've worked to expand a little bit on the 1964 Civil Rights Act, for instance, in public spaces. The 1964 conception of what the federal government could regulate in public spaces is a lot more narrow than it is now. And so the Equality Act would expand that to include, you know, just a modern day example, Uber and Lyft. That's not something that was understood in 1964, obviously. So it's a bill that when it becomes law, it will be really important for the Black community, for women, and certainly for LGBT people and for trans people. Yeah, that's what I'll say about it.
Awesome. Yeah, in this National Advocacy Summit tomorrow, we're having a national day of action to advocate for the Do No Harm Act, to get a hearing in the Judiciary Committee in the House, to eventually get a vote in the House. We know it'll be a tough road in the Senate, but as Scott and Mara were saying, we fight because you have to have the conversation, you have to have the vote, you have to educate lawmakers and change the will, and you do that through the vehicle of legislation. So we're really proud of that. Before we go to audience Q&A, I kind of want to shift gears a little bit. Scott was speaking about efforts earlier to peel us apart, to break up our coalitions. So I want to talk about the idea of a moral fusion movement and how that concept might guide our work forward. So for context, moral fusion movement is a phrase or an idea that comes from the Reverend Bishop Dr. William Barber and the Poor People's Campaign. You know, Dr. Barber lays out this idea. It has two components. Moral fusion movement is one, the moral part. Barber is really careful to articulate that that's not a religious belief or one set of religious beliefs, but rather it's about moving away from partisan debates and returning public discourse to one that is rooted in our deep constitutional and moral values. And the second part of that is movement, to be in a fusion coalition, which is an idea that actually comes from the era of Reconstruction in this country. And so, you know, we may not all agree on the exact coordinates of where we're moving or how we get there, but we're going in the same direction. And so I want to ask all of you, starting with Hillary, how have you seen moral fusion movement in action under this administration? And how can we, AU supporters of church-state separation, be part of a moral fusion movement with you?
No, very good. In some ways, I would argue that perhaps the terminology has evolved some, but the concept itself has been with us for quite some time. Some we refer to oftentimes as a convergence in interests. And that is to say that we find ourselves fighting for the same thing, even if we may have come over on different boats in different ways and different experiences. And whether we're thinking about the communities we're able to live in as a predominantly African-American community or otherwise, the convergence is we all want the same things. We all want safety and security and opportunity for our children. We all want to be able to live in safe, secure communities in which the police do indeed serve and protect, regardless of what you look like, how you speak, where you came from, what your preferences might very well be. That you do have equal opportunity. If you ask anyone, whether you're even talking to the most extreme white supremacists, I just believe lost their way in understanding how things work within a democracy and find themselves so desperate that they'll fight for themselves in a way that they will actually end up damaging other people throughout the process. That issue that you raised about making sure, as you know, doctors often say, to first do no harm. So as we move ahead, one of the things I think that that I've learned, at least working in such a broad coalition as we have now, is that we may have talked about even some of these issues in different ways, but we end up actually wanting the same thing. I can tell you so many stories of talking with, for instance, friends from the American Association of University Women, a predominantly white women's organization. I didn't think would want to have anything to do with addressing new policies to address concerns around racial profiling. But indeed, when I raised the issue with the lobbyists at the time, the only question she asked me is, what's in it for the women first? But it made very clear to say, look, here's how this impacts all of us. And she ended up saying, well, you know, two things just occurred. One is I had to think about it a little bit differently as well, and how it affects folks that don't just look like the ones that I represent all the time, but seeing that indeed they do impact them along the way. So the American Association of University Women signed on to the End Racial Profiling Act because they recognized what its impact was there. When I've sat down and talked with my friends to do housing and economic development and other issues, CRL, the Leadership Conference, and other organizations along those lines, when we're talking about issues of racial discrimination in housing, as it turned out, there's a form of women or gender discrimination in housing as well. There's a discrimination in housing against people who happen to be various religious perspectives and beliefs. Something that was old school that may have been written specifically to actually discriminate against one particular group at the time, we find it's been utilized to discriminate against anyone that happened to be a little bit differently. So as we think about where that interests converge, we're thinking about those moral values. It means also having to be able to utilize empathy throughout the process as well. How does this affect you as to think about how it affects me? I thought more about me and the folks that I represent, but when I hear about the folks from the Jewish community, our friends from the Arab communities, our friends from the Muslim communities, our friends from the LGBTQ communities and otherwise, we see there is such a similar impact on those areas that you just have to ask the question about how the concerns affect them. And what you find is that we're fighting for the same thing. With a tweak here and a fine tuning there, we can all want to see America live up to its constitutional promises once again of equal protection and equal opportunity for all.
Scott or Mara?
I have nothing to add to that.
Yeah, Hillary nailed it.
Right. So on that note of hope and optimism and what it means to think about our shared interests, I want to bring Rachel back into the conversation, and we're going to do some audience Q&A. So Rachel, I will turn it over to you.
Hi. Okay. First of all, hello, friends. Hi, Hillary. Hi, Mara. Hi, Scott. It's great to see you and to be with you. I miss being at coalition tables with you, and I so appreciate you, all the work that you do for your causes and our cause, which, as we've been talking about, are so joined at the hip in this moral fusion movement that we're building. So I think the first question that I want to ask from the Q&A is from Lawrence Warman, which in fact is the first question that came in. And the question is, what will it take to get our issues part of the presidential discourse? So, you know, I take that to mean part of the discourse during the elections and to sort of elevate it. And specifically, Lawrence says, separation of church and state. So that's always a conundrum. That's something that we ask ourselves all the time, and would love you all, including Sarah, you know, to give some answers.
Yeah. So, hey, this is, I really appreciate this question because, you know, a lot of the premise of the work that we do at Muslim Advocates that we have to fight against is that bigotry against the community we represent is politically popular. And the truth is, it is not, in the strict sense of the term. So when we did lots of pretty involved poll testing and in different formats, and we really tried to ask the question in the most generous ways as possible to get to get as honest of an answer as we can from folks. And we essentially tested messages around religious freedom that were designed to be exclusive and had a more of a Christian nationalist frame, like this is a Christian nation type messaging, versus America is a religious place for religious freedom for all people. And one of the things that we found is that, AU's messaging is popular. And what happens is there's some people that really just don't like what we all represent. And those people will dig deep. And the Trump, and obviously, I mean, there's a lot of pundits out there who will tell you the Trump strategy is to like go deep on a smaller number of people. But I think that there's no reason, I think, for people who share our values to not talk about this and to not talk about America as a place where you can be any religion or no religion at all, and that should be respected. So to the extent that there is skepticism from people who share our values about talking about this, I don't think that's quite the right assessment. Now, how we become more successful, that's another question. But I've been really impressed with the Moral Fusion movement. I've been really impressed with how folks are bringing sort of this ascendant religious left that's really talking about religion in ways that are empowering to everybody. And those are the places to look for, in my opinion.
Thanks, Scott. Does anyone else want to join in?
I do. I do, and I agree with Scott. I would want to think about it a little bit more. I mean, here's an uncomfortable truth. I don't want Joe Biden to now start suddenly talking a lot about separation of church and state in the last 56 days. I want him to keep pounding on Trump for all of Trump's incompetencies and venalities and et cetera. But I think the message is an important one in a segmented or targeted way, and it's time to figure that out. The first, I started NCTE now 18 years ago, and the first race in 2004, I got the campaign to meet with us, but the campaign hid the candidates from me. They would not let me anywhere near the candidates because they didn't want to have trans people be an issue. And honestly, in 2004, that was probably okay. That isn't okay now. And all of the major presidential candidates were interviewed by us last year. You can see them at Transform the White House, and Vice President Biden and Senator Harris were among them. And that's really good for us, but we're not pushing right now for them to say transgender, transgender, transgender in the final 2 months, because that wouldn't help trans people. And so I think the conversations with the campaign and the conversations with the transition team, and then the conversations with a Biden administration, if there is one, that's where it's going to be a lot more important. And then I'd be happy to start thinking through what this looks like in 2024. But practically speaking, what do you do in the next 56 days, except just keep jumping up and down on Trump's head?
Because I appreciate that, and certainly in true Washington speak with myself with the comments of both Scott and Mara as they've raised these very important concerns. We've also begun working hard to make sure that our perspective and our values are reflected in first the platforms of the political parties. As you know, this is the one time in 4 years that both political parties get together to do a couple major things. Number one, decide who their candidate is going to be that runs for president, who their vice presidential candidate is going to be as well. But under normal circumstances, this is where they'd actually set their platform forth as well. So we spent a lot of time with the Democrats and sent a letter to the Republicans as well. Unfortunately, we've got hit with a real problematic point of access. That is for some reason, and let me say this for the record, the NAACP is nonpartisan. We do not endorse political candidates or political parties. We don't support or oppose. We do, however, have a very active political platform. That is, we have policies that are determined by our membership, and we share those with whoever's running for office because we'd like them to reflect those values as well. The Democratic Party was very receptive. As a matter of fact, they asked me to serve on the platform committee as a response to our consistent push for them to include these important issues into those platforms. And so far, that part looks very good. Sadly, the Republican Party decided to dispense with this platform process altogether, which is very concerning to me in many ways, particularly if these parties consider themselves very much Democratic small d as part of that truly important process that is the United States of America. So pushing along those lines, and people should not stop sending those letters and assessments to the political candidates as well. Both political party websites have a way for you to send that information in. I can't guarantee one will read it or the other will not, but I can say that's the push that needs to happen. The final thing I would say is things are a little bit different because we're dealing with coronavirus as well. Under previous circumstances, many of the rallies that would go on across the country would provide an opportunity for everyday folks to be able to challenge the candidates on where their issues are, their concerns, and tell their stories. So that becomes one of the challenges for those of us that push these issues here in Washington as well. You have those that will look at the data. We think the data is important. That's why we insist the data collection is part of any civil rights, civil liberties, or voting rights bill we push forward. That's crucially important. But we also push to make sure that as people are moving along those lines, they understand where we stand. Why it's important to us, how this impacts our community. We have to share the anecdotes of the hit that they take on people that are a little bit different because they were so narrowly focused when they were moving their agenda forward. Our voices need to be there. Our system values our voices being there, and it's crucially important that we continue to push along those at every stage in this process for those that are going to be voting our perspective within this republic.
You know, one thing that I'm noticing in this conversation is it feels like it's almost impossible not to be talking about politics at the same time as we're talking about our issues. And I wanted to come to sort of a combination of some of the questions in the question box, looking at Gloria's, Craig's, I'm looking at even Helen's. Gloria said, well, she was talking about what I believe, Scott, you said about Tony Perkins and saying Islam is not even a religion, saying, well, I don't even get it. Like, why isn't Tony Perkins saying Judaism isn't a religion or Buddhism isn't why isn't anyone who's not a very narrow form of a white Christian not a religion? But then going to what Craig says, which is, wait a minute, is this even a religious stance or is this a political stance that Tony Perkins and his cronies are operating from? And finally, and this is just sort of popcorn, just giving you all stuff to react to since we have limited time. Helen, also is talking sort of about the politics of the movement and says, Hillary, you talked a lot about these segregation academies and the sordid history of vouchers, but isn't it also true that the white evangelical movement at some point felt like they had to move off of their avowed sort of attacks on desegregation, and didn't they at that time adopt abortion as a winning political issue? So that's a lot to react to, but just wanted to try to get to as many people as we can. So who wants to start?
Well, I'll begin kicking in. I'll try to keep it nice and short and sweet. But it's important to have those analysis. But let me also say, as we compared issues like abortion to issues of segregation, how the game was played, I'm not sure they were as calculating, nor should we give them credit for being quite that calculating in deciding to substitute one form of discrimination with another, hoping they get more support moving things along that lines. But we have seen people surely take the opportunity to find some way to shoehorn their issue is, as ugly as it may be under some of these circumstances. So it is important that we see what's going on and provide that kind of measurement. We're always hearing the voices of those that are going to be impacted as we have in this conversation as well. Again, and also we still need to share the data. We have a saying at the NAACP, so looking at trying to solve these problems to provide equal protection, equal opportunity under law as well. We have to collect the data and see who's being impacted. So as we're moving towards solutions, we're calculating through that process every step of the way. In other words, we have a saying that I'm hoping to make some money off sweatshirts that says, in order to manage the problem, you must first measure it. So in looking at these issues and these challenges, we have to take the time with each of these concerns to measure it carefully as we move forward to manage again towards equality and equal opportunity and protection in our society.
I really appreciate that. Does anyone else want to come in on this morass of questions?
You know, I do. And I want to say that I probably went a little too partisan. We also are a nonpartisan organization, but we have been very critical of the Trump administration all along. We have a page on our website called the Discrimination Administration. We've chronicled the 90 ways he's attacked trans people specifically, plus some of the ways he's generally attacked us. You know, I struggle with this a lot. In 2016, when Mr. Khan from Virginia, you'll remember he was the Gold Star father who talked about his son, he said something that I wanted to remember, and it has been harder and harder every year since then, but he said that Republicans are half of what's good in this beautiful country. And honestly, the president has made that harder and harder. We do need to remember it, and we do need to remember what policy is for. It's for bettering lives, and we do need to remember what politics are for. Politics are not a zero-sum thing that we either win and vanquish people or we don't. Politics are a way for us to work as a community to get what we need and to smooth over all of our differences. And that's getting harder and harder as we're separating into two camps increasingly, two camps around religion, two camps around race, two camps around everything. And we have to try to figure that out. I'm not advocating for a unilateral disarmament, but somebody's got to figure it out. We are in a toxic morass where everybody is increasingly, everybody including me personally, is becoming toxically morally certain about our positions. And we have to figure out that. It is the antithesis of politics. It's the antithesis of policy. It's the antithesis of religion. And we have to figure out how to all be better as individuals and be better as a society. And I don't know where we go from there, and I don't know who leads us through that, but we're in a mess right now. And I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Yeah, Mara, one of the things I have loved about being at AU and the work that we do is our most passionate members are our ardent atheist members and our deeply religious members. That one of the things that I think AU does really well is creating space that, rather than shouting across a great divide about separation of religion and government, is asking people to come to the table and have that conversation like we're doing today, to have the conversation of how are our interests similar here. And whether you're a non-religious or an atheist person or a deeply observant Muslim or Jewish or Christian or other religious person, separation of religion and government is a place where we have shared interests and shared values. And so I want to offer that that's been one of the real delights about being at AU, is being in a role where I am working with people who do have very different beliefs about something as critical as religion, something that is so deep and passionate about who we are. So I wanted to offer that as well, Rachel.
Yeah, that's great, Sarah. I love that too. We really are Americans united. Now that we have so little time left, I thought of one last question for the panelists. If you all could make it short. When I've talked about church-state separation around the country, what I've found is that there are so many entry points, and that's sort of what we're talking about at coming to the issue. Even aside from the organizations that you all are so involved in leading, and Sarah, I'm going to include you too in this. Can each of you say just a few words about how you personally connect to the issue of keeping religion and government separate? And then Sarah, you should then close the panel. Who wants to go first? Mara?
Yeah. Sure. I'm not a religious person. And I look at it, the framing Sarah gave at the beginning, of course, is something I really believe in, that religion should be a shield, or freedom of religion should be a shield, not a sword. And I just always remember that the Constitution's religion protections are really meant to protect religion from the government, not protect the government from religion, and that's just really important. I'll stop. I'll be short.
Why don't I very succinctly say, as succinctly as I can at least, say that religion I've always viewed as something that drives your values. In a democratic society, small d democratic society, is bringing those values to the table as we try to fight for what's in the best interest of all the people. The reasons diversity is so important is because you want to make sure those values and experiences are very much on the table as well, as we're solving our nation's problems and improving conditions for everyone. So as we're thinking about these issues, I agree, separation of church and state is crucially important to preserve. That what last thing we want is theocracy that moves an agenda that goes after people simply because of an interpretation of a writing in someone's religious book. We've seen it too often. We've also seen people within that same religious grouping disagreeing with each other as well. So the best struggles as we think about is having that fight for all of us, making sure the diversity of all the voices are there, the right decisions can be made, and we can work together, again, to enforce those decisions and make our nation even greater still.
Scott, Sarah?
Yeah. So no, I think thank you for having this question. I think, oftentimes in conversations that we have about, in my work about, ensuring the rights of American Muslims, so often what comes up is sort of this idea that Muslims need to do more work. Like Muslims need to go out there and hug all the non-Muslims and have a conversation and knock on their doors. And there's a lot of temptation to sort of nod your head with that and go along. But the truth of the matter is, and this is what gets me engaged in this work, is that you don't really need to know everybody to know your own values, right? Like you don't need to know every community that's going to get defended. You don't need to know every religion. You don't need to, but you do need to know your own values and what you stand for. And for me, I know that this is supposed to be a country where I could be anything I want. Thank you very much. Right? Any religion, anything that's not harming someone else. And that's enough for me. And the allergy that I have to folks dictating from a hall of power how people are supposed to lead their lives is very troubling to me. And that's what's going to always bring me back.
Ooh, it's a great question, Rachel. I am a non-theist Quaker who's studying to be a humanist chaplain for some future act in my life. And the importance of separation of religion and government for me is that it is about fundamentally equality. It's about the promise of this country that says that we are equal in the eyes of the law. And our founders, the contradiction of our founding is that our founders said those words, but they didn't even extend equality to everyone. Most of the people on this panel were not fully equal in the eyes of the founders, but there's this bit about more perfect. And for me, separation of religion and government and doing that work is about equality, and it's about striving for that more perfect democratic union. And so I'm really grateful, Hillary and Scott and Mara and Rachel, for you joining me today in that work towards becoming more perfect and more equal. It is a joy and a pleasure and an honor to get to be beside you in this work today. Before we sign off, I want to let all of our participants know that next up is a series of workshops. We're going to start with a workshop about the Do No Harm Act that we've mentioned a few times this morning, really diving into like what's in that bill and why are we even fighting for it and what will it do. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that. Our panelists, or some of our panelists, will be in the chat box interacting with you. So while our workshops have been pre-recorded, we do have live Q&A available. So we hope you'll stay tuned. This is the main stage. You can be here all day long, all the way until 6:30 this evening, right here. And so thank you to our guests and to all of you for joining us this morning. We appreciate you, and we're so grateful to have you for the National Advocacy Summit. Thank you so much.